Hey, it's Mazzy, and welcome back. The 2024 Beatles releases, solo, books, music, family, a few other excursions here. I thought I'd put together sort of a buyer's guide to the Beatles in 2024. I know some people are sick and tired of hearing about the Beatles and all the releases and the reissues and the repackages, but as a collector, for 60 years this year, am all in still, and I get most of the variants and the various releases. Now I'm going to showcase some of the books that came out this year. This seems to be a book every other week, so I just picked a selection of the best books, I think, or the most interesting books. But think of this as a little bit of a holiday guide to the Beatles releases for 2024. I'm going to start out with something that is not the Beatles, but is a really good album of Beatle covers from an artist who I adore. And this is Lucinda Williams sings The Beatles recorded at Abbey Road Studios. Now, Lucinda Williams is this alt country, folksy, dirgy, swampy singer and guitar player, and has a great band, and I've seen her live several times. She started off doing sort of country blues things. I think it was on Folkways or Smithsonian Folkways way back. But over the last several decades, she's put together a really wonderful series of albums and live performances. And she's got this kind of vocal range. It sounds like she has marbles in her mouth, and it's really a unique thing. In a way, she's swampy, like a sloppy Keith Richards, a female version of Keith Richards, where he still gets the essence of rock and roll and country blues, like the Stones do when they cross over in their country world. Now, during the pandemic, she started a series, and the series was called Lou's Jukebox, and these were put together as quickly produced records of cover songs, a series of albums that they would record over maybe 2 days. They'd rehearse them and then record them quickly and get them out there. The first one was one of Tom Petty. She did a Bob Dylan one. She did a soul one. She did a whole series. And this is number 7 in the series. And they recorded over 2 days, 2.5 days maybe, at Abbey Road Studios. And she does a great series of covers of these great Beatles songs. Now, she doesn't stray far away from the original arrangements, but she definitely has her own unique sound. Don't Let Me Down, Rain, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Your Blues, I'm So Tired, amongst others. Her band is tight. She's got this live feel in a studio, very much like Get Back and Let It Be. And so, highly recommended. This would be a good place to start, especially for a Beatle fan, but it just came out in the last month, and I think it's very, very successful. Lucinda Williams sings the Beatles from Abbey Road Studios. Next, I'm going to go into the books of the year. Now, I'm going to start out with a book that actually came out in 2023, but it's carried over because of the photography show. And this is a great book, and this would be a great Christmas book for someone. Paul McCartney's Eyes of the Storm, 1964. These are photographs that Paul took their first tour when all the Beatles got Nikon cameras. A lot of people have seen the Ringo shots from that period. And these were sort of found in a drawer in an archive, put together, developed, and put together for a book and a show. The book is fantastic. It actually came out the middle of 2023 to celebrate the opening of a show promoting the book, and the book promoted the show at the National Portrait Gallery in London. Didn't get to see that. It wasn't there when I was there. But earlier this year it was in Brooklyn. Now it's in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to see it in early January. And it will continue on. So if you don't get a chance to see the show, I highly recommend this book. The photographs are not just of the Beatles. Here's Neil Aspinall and John Lennon. Everything that happened in their trip to New York and then Washington, D.C. as well. You've seen the Maisley Brothers film of the Beatles in America, which centers around this documentary that just came out. I'm not going to get into that documentary. Maybe for another day. I think it was okay, not great, But 1964, we're definitely celebrating the 60th anniversary of Beatlemania and the Beatles' arrival in America. And this book of Paul McCartney, from the bird's eye view of Paul McCartney and the Beatles, really celebrates that. So one of the best books of the last year, and even though it was released in 2023, it really rolls out with the show touring. Next, another book that probably came out the end of 2023, but I think it's one of the best photography books, one of the great photographers that followed the Beatles around early on, and it's British photographer Terry O'Neill, and this is The Beatles, The Definitive Collection. Terry O'Neill photographed the Beatles early on, and in fact, over their entire career. So you have great photographs, beautifully designed, beautifully printed, following the early days from in the studio, from on the road, to even later in the years when, here we go, some promo things around 1965 there, and 66. And then you even have the later years. Well, actually, here we go, 1967 or 8, George Harrison, and going into the later years, that infamous shot that was in Life magazine at Ringo and Barbara Bach's wedding after John Lennon died, and you get kind of a wonderful reunion photograph. I just think, the beauty and the sadness of this photograph where you're missing John and Yoko in it. But a wonderful photographic essay, a photographic book of the overview. It goes into later shots of George Harrison as well, too. Another book that is photo and art, and I have to show this because this is in essence pretty much the catalog, Music of the Mind, Yoko Ono. This is a show I saw this summer in August at the Tate Modern. A fantastic show of Yoko Ono's conceptual artwork, her music. There was various environmental sections of the studio, from the infamous ladder with this glass that says yes, that John Lennon first connected with Yoko, a section of their music of all her albums. You could listen to selections from those albums. Her conceptual work from the early days in the early 60s with the Fluxus movement, her collaborations with John Cage and other artists of that day, and pictorial things of Cut Piece and her films. And it was a wonderful, wonderful show. I just love the artwork of Yoko Ono and the conceptual side of it, the performance side, art side. And this book really kind of illustrates, there's Cut Piece right there. Yoko Ono, The Music of the Mind, the catalog from the show. I think that show is touring other countries, other cities. If it's near you, definitely check it out if you're a fan of modern art, conceptual art, and performance art. And then Mind Games. Now, I'm going to get into Mind Games in this video when I show music, but every time Sean and Yoko have been putting out this series, the reissues, expanded reissues of John Lennon's solo career. So far, Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, and now Mind Games. They did conspicuously, in his absence, skipped over sometime in New York City, but they separately, there is a book published by Thames and Hudson that really dives deep into the record, their lives before, during, and after the time of the recording of Mind Games. And it is very in-depth of the time. Photographically, it is, again, also like a museum catalog. The times that was happening politically with John and Yoko, a fantastic segment in terms of John's time trying to get his green card in America, in New York City. And the politics of John Lennon, John and Yoko Ono at the time. A fantastic pictorial, a fantastic read, a deep dive into John and Yoko around the time of Mind Games. Then we got kind of the tell-alls, which is not really a tell-all. This is pretty much sanctioned by John and Yoko. But Elliot Mintz's book. Elliot Mintz, We All Shine On, John, Yoko, and Me, Elliot Mintz. Elliot Mintz was a publicist for John and Yoko. He really was a confidant, especially with Yoko and Sean, and helped them, go through the post John Lennon death somewhat, and really was close to them. And this just arrived, so I haven't read it yet, but I think it's something really interesting. Obviously, it's not a normal tell-all, shock value thing, because he's still a part of that. And even you're a part of it, it's going to tell realities of that. But I'm looking forward to this, and I'm going to read this over the holidays. We All Shine On, Elliot Mintz. Shake It Up Baby by Ken McNabb. This is either the second or third book Ken wrote. He wrote a book of, I think it's the Beatles in Scotland. So it's really centered around 1963, and as they were becoming huge in the UK. Obviously, Love Me Do came out in 62, but once Please Please Me hit number one in 1963 in the UK and parts of Europe. This kind of talks about that period of time in the Beatles. So I like when a book, it's hard to take on the whole story of the Beatles. It's so massive. We've learned that with Mark Lewison's Tune In. We've had one volume. It's been, 8, 9 years, 10 years, 12 years since that first volume came out. And he's still working on volume 2, and it's going to be at least 3 volumes. I hope it comes out in my lifetime. And probably one of the most anticipated books of the season, of the year of 2024, is volume 2, The McCartney Legacy. This is volume 2, 1974 to 1980, co-written by Alan Kozin, who has written several other Beatle books, as well as a classical music critic for the Washington Post. He taught at Juilliard and is a Beatle expert, a part of the one of the Beatle podcasts that comes out every couple of weeks. And Adrian Sinclair, who is a documentary producer, filmmaker, and editor in the UK. And this is an amazing book. Now, I have not read this book, so how can I say it's such an amazing book? I am guessing because their volume 1, an in-depth version, McCartney, 1969 to 1973, about the solo music career. This is not about the baby Paul McCartney, the Beatles, although they touch into that a little bit. But this is really about his solo years. And there's going to be, I think, at least one more volume, maybe more. But they get so in-depth, and they turn over things and come up with things that obviously I've never heard of, and a lot of other people never heard of. And really well done, put together in actually a pretty quick manner, considering it's been 3 years tops, maybe even less, between these two books, and we're still waiting 12 years down the line for Tune In Part 2. So this would be not only as a gift, giving someone volume 1, but I would say get them both. Give them the gift pack if they don't have these. So Paul McCartney, The McCartney Legacy, volumes 1 and 2. And then lastly, in this book section, another 2-part volume that just recently came out, written by Luca Perossi, The Beatles After the Beatles, 1967 to 1980. This is pretty much their solo career. Everything from the project with John and Yoko to the electronic sounds and Wonderwall with George Harrison, to the soundtracks, Family Way of Paul McCartney. And it goes on their entire throughout the 70s, their solo career. And he breaks it up really interesting. Part 1 is the narrative, and it really kind of tells stories about these. Now, these are the kind of books that I don't read from beginning to end. What I do is when I pull out these records, I'll take these off the shelf and sort of research and read and see if I learn anything new about that record. This is the more detailed, this is the discography that goes through every single release of those solo years. So together they make up a beautiful pair of the solo years, again, in 67 and 68 especially, and then of course throughout the career of their Apple records and the various labels they played on post Beatles, Dark Horse as well. So the Beatles After the Beatles, the solo careers of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, 1967 to 1980, Luca Perossi. Now let's get on to the music from the Beatles. And first I want to showcase a couple of family project, Sons of. This was an interesting record that came out of Record Store Day. I believe it's still available beyond Record Store Day. Dreamers in the Field. Now, this is a record that wouldn't be out of place in George Harrison's solo career early on, when he was doing things with the Radha Krishna Temple, when he was doing the Wonderwall soundtrack. This is a combination with Carmen Rizzo, the producer and innovator musician that does some really interesting effects, electronics, and Hun Hur Tu. It's a outfit that comes from the Russian-Mongolian border of throat noises, throat singing, where they do these really interesting, they emulate certain wind instruments using their vocals and their throats on here. And you have obviously Danny Harrison with his guitar and his instrumentation working on these together. Now, Carmen and Hun Hur Tu, they've collaborated before on 2 previous projects. This is the first time Danny Harrison was brought in, and this was released on Dark Horse Records. This is a really beautiful record. Again, this is a spiritual record. This is a meditative record. There's a theme that goes on with the meditations of from the Lennon side and definitely the Harrison side here. I just like when an artist brings these kind of a spiritual type of things on. This is Dark Horse on clear vinyl here. It's unusual record. It's not going to be a Beatle record at all. The only connection is Danny Harrison. But remember, this is from the spiritual side of the Harrison family. And obviously George passed this love on to Danny. And I think this is great that he is showcasing this and bringing this to a somewhat larger audience who likes this meditative, spiritual side of music. So Danny Harrison and Carmen Rizzo and Hun Hur Tu. This is a solo record by Sean Ono Lennon. I mean, obviously he's done his prog things with Les Claypool. He's done his solo kind of singer-songwriter thing way back. And this is kind of an experimental record. It's something he kind of wanted to do prior to the pandemic. He was talking to John Zorn, the avant-garde jazz fusion sax player, arranger, composer, originally to do something with. He wanted to do this music that mixed genres, mixed rock and jazz and spiritual jazz and out there jazz with artists. He talked to Nels Cline, the avant-garde guitar player who plays with Wilco as well. Julian Lange, the jazz guitar player who's on Blue Note Records. A lot of different artists. And in the end, Julian plays the parts himself, the guitar parts himself, and he does it really well. Again, there's some mood to this, some of this record. Some of this record is a little more intense and out there in a jazz rock fusion way. There's some elements of prog in here, but this is a really good record and a real surprise and very unlike anything we've heard from Sean Lennon commercially. And he talks about how this came about. There's an essay here that Sean does about how this came about, the journey of making this record. And I think it's a really good record. It's dedicated to Yoko Ono, and it is on John Zorn's label, Sean Ono Lennon. Mind Games. Now, Sean and Danny are really rolling out the anniversary editions that are not exactly the 50th year or the specific year celebrating that. Obviously, the pandemic threw everything off in timelines. Next year, we hear there's going to be the concert for Bangladesh, probably expanded album. Hopefully, they'll have some recordings from the afternoon set at Madison Square Gardens and the film being restored. But first, we got at Record Store Day earlier this year, Mind Games, the EP. This is the first taste of the remix from Mind Games. It has the ultimate mix, the remix. Now, Mind Games is probably the one, or maybe two with Sometime in New York, albums of John Lennon that massively needed a remix. I'm not always a fan of remixes, but Sean and his team here did this beautifully. It took that layer off, that mundane, dark layer that just stifled these songs. The musicians were professional New York musicians of the day that had worked with Yoko Ono, and you can really hear them clearly on this. Mind Games, the remix, it has I'm the Greatest, the ultimate mix, the version with John's guide vocal that Ringo would later do on his album that opened up that great Ringo album from 1973. Then 2 other tracks on here that gave us a teased what this reissue was going to be about. Then there's the proper normal vinyl reissue. Now this has the remix of the album, which again is superior than the original. I have multiple copies of the British, the MoFi, and the original American, and this is the way to go. And what's really nice is the second disc on this particular project has alternate versions of the entire album, and really done well curated by Danny. And then something that surprised, there was a app that Sean used to promote meditation mixes. Now this is out there. This is something that's not for everybody, but I like the artistic integrity of this and the experimentation of slowing down songs, taking tracks out, taking stems out of the music, and making it very kind of ethereal, meditative. And this is John Lennon's meditative mixes for Mind Games. This is a 3-record set. He wasn't going to put this on vinyl, and the label suggested they do. Again, this is a release not for everyone, but really, really experimental and interesting. There's a side that has lock track that literally I put it on and I just kind of dozed on the sofa waiting for the whole album to play, and it literally went on. That track was just locked in on almost like a loop. And it's really interesting on vinyl. I've only had, I think, one other record that I think it was a Jack White record maybe, that had a lock track like that, it's not skipping, but it's looping in a strange way. This is that. Again, not for everyone, not on CD. You only get it through the app or on this record, but I think this is not going to be around for a long time. So if you're interested, this is not for me showing collectability, just showcasing the releases of these artists. But this is one I think you might want to check out. If you like something in an experimental manner, that would be it. And of course, almost the ultimate is this. This is the CD Blu-ray box. Now, what I love about Sean Lennon curating this series, all the boxes, the physical form are exactly the same, so they fit nicely on a shelf. There's a certain aesthetic thing that I appreciate. This is fantastic. This has, of course, the ultimate mix on here, the elemental mixes. Now, I like hearing the progression of these songs, and Sean strips things back. You hear various parts of the instruments, whether it's the pedal steel, whether it's the keyboard player, the piano player. This is beautiful. John's vocals. Again, the progression of how the song starts in the studio and goes through that whole progression till the final bit. This is like a deep dive, and I just adore this series. Of course, they have the Blu-rays, the DVDs, and they also have these wonderful books. Now, this is different. There is some overlapping content from the book I showed earlier, the Mind Games consumer book, the one you can buy separately. But this really concentrates on the recording of the album. And what's really wonderful about this, I read this from start to finish. I really love hearing all the points of view of the musicians who were there. Contemporary interviews with Gordon Edwards and everybody who played on it, who's still around. Dave Spinoza on guitar, John Lennon, the Mind Games, the Ultimate Collection, and of course, the one that blew a lot of people away, or people mocked it too, but is the Mind Games Cube. And I'm not going to bring it out right here, but I am going to show it here because it was something that I was amazed, and I had to do an over-the-top unveiling of it. I don't normally do unboxings, but this was more of a presentation. and I went through the entire cube that had art pieces, photographs, lyrics, games, the whole premise of Mind Games. Sean really took that and ran with it and did these really interesting things. Over the top, absolutely, but obviously the son of Yoko Ono as the conceptual artist. And after seeing her show this time, and I did see a show, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, I really appreciate that artwork and what that's like. And the Mind Games Cube emulates that for a collective piece and a collector's piece in a way. Now, I just like it. I always talk about it's the music, but it's the art in this essence. That goes beyond the music as an artistic statement, if there ever was one. And I think Sean and his design team and his audio team did it perfectly. So Mind Games, the Cube. And then we switch over to the George Harrison estate, Danny Harrison and Olivia, curating the 50th anniversary of Living in the Material World. Of course, the album came out in 1973. It was George's follow-up after Bangladesh and All Things Must Pass, his follow-up solo album, a very spiritual album and a very beautiful album. And I said in the video, and I'm gonna have some links after this to previous videos, I wasn't a huge fan of the remix of this record, but I do love the outtakes and the alternate versions that he included on here. This is a form factor that I appreciate. It's closer to the form factor of All Things Must Pass. Again, I love when they continue a similar form factor if they're gonna do a catalog of records. This has a separate box with the Apple Studios. Again, there's a full overview on that video where I present this. I urge you to check that out. But showing the tape box, there are illustrations, photographs in the book that accompanies this record, and how this album was started at Abbey Road, finished at Friar Park. The cover art, outtakes of the cover art. Beautiful essays of the time, of course, the obligatory tape boxes. We all want to see those tape boxes. Now, Danny doesn't do these all analog, nor does Sean for the John Lennon stuff, which is unfortunate. But, you know, some people feel the way to go is digital transfers. I'm not against digital transfers. It's unfortunate that at a time when these tapes are probably still in great shape, they don't do all analog cuts. But still, this is a great package and would make a great gift for the holiday season, as late as we are in it. George Harrison's 50th anniversary of Living in the Material World. I'm sure more will come. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the Fabs themselves, the Beatles. First of all, I want to give a shout out to someone named Bruce. I don't recall his screen name here, so I apologize, Bruce, if you're watching. He sent me this a while ago, and I'm going to keep it in my collection because National Album Day is something that only happens in the UK. It's separate than Record Store Day. And they put out an edition, the stereo remastered album on heavyweight 180-degree vinyl. A white vinyl version of A Hard Day's Night. 60th anniversary of the movie and the soundtrack of A Hard Day's Night. This is actually not the soundtrack. This is what came out in Britain. All the songs on side one and then side two, other songs. Remember, America, we got the actual soundtrack with the George Martin songs, the score. This is probably the digital cut that came out in 2009. I assume it's the same cut on white vinyl. And I want to thank Bruce for sending me. Very generous. This is the kind of thing I keep in my collection, the variants like this. And I didn't go out seeking the British one, but I want to thank Bruce for sending this to me. Hard Day's Night, the British edition in stereo. And then we go to 60 years of Beatlemania. The Beatles arrive in America, February 1964, and everything changed for me and a lot of people of my generation. This is the Target exclusive blue vinyl that came out. of Meet the Beatles. We know that this year, Capitol put out the 1964 albums, the American albums in mono. Dave Dexter, added reverb to some of these songs. He made them digestible for the American audience. Now, one could argue that they probably would have sold anyway and been as famous if Dexter didn't touch them and left them alone. But they reconfigured certain records because of the publishing differences, America versus the UK. They put on only 10, 11, 12 tracks rather than the 14 tracks in the UK. Different titles for every 2 albums the Beatles made. There were probably 3 albums released in America. These are the records that the Americans and some other countries grew up with in the 1960s. These records in stereo were in print for 25 years. So until 1987, 1988, these are the records that most Americans heard. I didn't get any British albums until Sgt. Pepper, late 67, and then in 68, I started collecting all the British editions. And yes, the British editions are the definitive editions, the editions the Beatles wanted, and that's the way the artist's intent was. However, the American audience is a big audience, and not to, go against what the Beatles wanted, the Brits wanted, these are the records that we heard. I was surprised when I heard this was coming out, that they were going to the original master tapes, the American master tapes, which means they're dubs and worked on. So they're probably, 3rd generation, I would say. And I do want to say, I was so surprised how good this collection is. I expected not to like this, thinking, okay, I got to get it for my collection, but it's done really well. Now, is it as good as the UK releases in mono? No, it's not that. Different configurations. The Beatles' second album is probably their best rock and roll album. Again, there's a whole video on this box set. Meet the Beatles, it's just historic because this is the album that we got. Now, they do go with one album from 1965, the early Beatles, on Capitol Records, and that's mainly because that's the record that initially Introducing the Beatles put out. Somewhat, not exactly, and there's still songs missing, but Capitol put this out in 1965, covering songs from 63 and 64. Of course, there's the actual soundtrack with the George Martin songs. I love this. I love those kind of jazzy, schmaltzy, over-the-top covers of Beatles songs that George Martin arranged, kind of groovy, baby, type things. And of course, all the other records in this set. The Beatles story. Now, the Beatles story only comes in the box, but I'll say one thing about this. A lot of people are criticizing this. It's useless. You don't need it. Why pay more? I understand the price is more with this, and it's really not necessary. But think about this as nostalgia. Part of this box, I will agree, is a nostalgia thing. But in 1964, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have MTV, we didn't have these documentaries showing up about the Beatles. And this is like an AM radio documentary that would have been broadcast in the day in 1964. We had a Billy Shepherd biography that came out, I believe, that year. We had some teen magazines, and that was it. So this was a way to learn the basic story of the Beatles. Is it dated? Absolutely. But it's something that is really interesting. Beatles 65, of course, too. I think these sound really good considering what they could have sounded like. They did an excellent job. Is it perfect? No, but I enjoyed this. I think it was a surprise that happened, and I applaud them for doing this. Again, I'm one that hopes they continue in 1965 box, do the American versions. We want the American versions of Help. At least I want the American version of Help done. I would definitely want them to do mono and stereo, the American configuration of Rubber Soul. And some of us feel that's the better track listing, or the more consistent, has a different feel. But again, what's great about these are not a replacement. These are just an alternative. The Beatles, 60 years, since the British invasion, since the Beatlemania started in America. I know we're a year to 2 years too late than the Brits got them, but it all changed for a lot of people, including myself. So these are the Beatles releases for 2024. Maybe a gift guide, something to check out. One or more of these as gifts. The books are kind of cool. The records are kind of cool as well. So thanks for watching. Always Beatles in this house. Mazzy loves you.